Hello, friends. In this session, we learn the effect of visual impairment on growth and development. We discuss the impact of visual impairment on physical growth, motor, language, social, and cognitive development. The term visual impairment refers to all degrees of reduction in vision. The term blindness is defined as having no more vision than light perception in both eyes. Even after corrective lenses or treatment, there is no difference in vision. Visual impairment presents at birth could be due to genetic anomalies or due to injury to the developing visual system. The infant born without sight receives input from other senses, but the input is not continuous but intermittent input and may appear diminished. Thus, the child receives inconsistent, discrete, and generally unverified fragments of information. Hearing is the only distant sense available to the visually impaired infant, but the infant has no control over the presence or absence of sound in his environment. Sound without visual verification is only noise coming from somewhere. Only after repeated tactual, motor, and auditory interaction does sound acquire meaning. Only then can sound provide information about location, cause, or source. Sound is not a strong motivator as vision is. A totally vision impaired child may not reach for an object based on sound cue alone until 12 months. Environmental exploration is usually delayed until the child reaches 18 months. Normally, the incentive for tactile exploration is supplied by visual dimensions like color, pattern, shape, and location. These dimensions are unavailable to a blind infant. Therefore, purposeful tactile activity is minimal because the environment remains unknown and uninviting. Lowenfeld in 1950 described in detail the objective effects of visual impairment. Let us discuss this in detail. Lowenfeld explained the objective effects of visual impairment as impairment affects three important areas. Primarily, it affects the type of experience the child has. Visual impairment affects the ability for travel within the environment and it imposes limitations in their involvement in the communities. The people who cannot see mostly use their sense of touch and kinesthetic response of the body to external stimuli like heat or cold to gain an actual knowledge of the world around them. As we all know, sight is a long distance sense that gives details of form, size, colors, and spatial relationship of the objects. Vision gives these details within a short span of time, but touch requires direct contact with the object to convey the details of form and size. Touch sense needs longer period of time to observe and then understand. Touch does not convey colors. It does not permit observation of spatial relationship. Spatial relationship here means the position of the object in relation to position of oneself in the environment. Touch sense limits direct contact because they cannot be applied to things that are inaccessible, too large, or too small, or too fragile. Also, objects in certain conditions, such as moving, turning, boiling, and objects that need to be kept in containers, cannot be observed directly by touch. On the other hand, touch sense has its distinct asserts in conveying surface quality, texture, temperature, resistance, weight pliability, and spatial form. The substitution of touch for sight puts the person with blindness at a disadvantage. For example, he must read by touch, and touch reading is slower than visual reading. Though he can gain knowledge of the world around him, his knowledge is sometimes incomplete and distorted. In these ways, visual impairment limits the range and a variety of experiences to a visually impaired person. It perhaps the most obvious. The visually impaired person cannot move about as quickly as and as easily as his seeing peers. Vision permits a person to control his environment and himself in relation to the environment. The visually impaired person cannot recognize a seeing person with one glance what his environment is and what changes occur in it. So there is limitation in interaction with the environment. The seeing person learns by visual observation and imitation, but for the visually impaired person, learning is taking place through other sensory awareness. Also, other information offered by newspaper headlines, window displays, television, and other pictorial representations are not available to persons with blindness. Vision loss can impact all areas of development. Social development is affected as children are not able to pick up on non-verbal clues or if they are unable to make eye contact. They may appear disinterested and can reduce sustained social interactions. Loss of vision impact motor development as child may not be motivated or move toward for fear of unknown. Exploration of the environment and materials is critical in cognitive development of concepts. Language acquisition is reduced due to limited interaction with the people and the environment, but active interaction is important in language development. Delays in areas of independence in activities of daily living are impacted as incidental learning through observation is not possible. Childhood blindness has an adverse effect on growth and development of visually impaired children. When a child has visual impairment, she or he appears to be over clumsy. Vision loss might be the cause for the child, constantly running into things or falling down. Because visually impaired children lack both the motivation and opportunity for free and varied movement, these children cannot learn to run and play by imitating other children. They lack vitality and physical stamina. They have poor posture. Mobility difficulties cause visually impaired children to miss many opportunities for developing gross motor, example, catching ball, and fine motor skills, for example, picking up bits of paper. These children may exhibit abnormal motor expressive skills such as gait and posture, for example, tilting head or holds head in an awkward position. Young visually impaired children sometimes display mannerism like rocking back and forth, eye pressing, and poking. The visually impaired children appear clumsy, especially in a new situation. They may hold head in an awkward position to look at something or hold a book or objects in a peculiar position to look at them. They may constantly ask others to tell him what is going on around. They show signs of inattentiveness or fatigue. They may present poor self-concept and ego development. The hands are a major perceptual organ to everyone. A visually impaired infant has significant developmental delays in his ability to use his hands functionally. Even at 5 months, a blind infant's hands will be fisted and held at shoulder height. There will be no mutual fingering, no engaging at the midline. At this age, a sighted child is practicing coordinated reaching and transference of objects from one hand to another. This delay in hand utilization will result in delay in fine motor or gross motor development. Without vision, eye and hand do not work together. This takes much experience and is achieved much later than normal eye hand coordination. Instead, ear hand coordination must occur. A blind infant usually achieves control of his posture at approximately the same age as sighted infants through normal progression. For example, sits alone momentarily, rolls from back to stomach, sits alone steadily, takes stepping movements when hands are held, stands alone, and bridges on hands and knees. However, the achievements that require self initiated mobility are significantly delayed in elevated on arms in prone, raising to a sitting position, pulling to a stand, and walking alone. Until a visually impaired child will reach out to grasp a sound cue, approximately at 12 months, he will not move out in space either on hands, on knees, or feet. The blind child's difficulty or reluctance in moving around the environment encourages passive behavior such as self stimulating mannerisms like tossing head, eye poking, and rocking body. The visually impaired child has an unusual dependence on a sighted person to mediate and help integrate his environment. This notion of dependence must be considered as a major factor in the visually impaired child's development. The child has diminished control over his environment and can only control his inner world. As he withdraws into this world, he reduces the need for social interaction. He may not understand that there is a complex world outside of himself, that he is separate from it, that he can both act on it and be the participant or recipient of action. In a sighted child, the mutual smile between infant and mother is the beginning of attachment, recognition, and communication. The blind child will smile at 2 months in recognition of his mother's voice, but only nuzzling and tickling will regularly elicit a smile. In later years, the child appears to have undecided emotional involvement and appears disinterested, non communicative, and uninformed about the rudiments of play with his peers. Consequently, he may be avoided by his peers and rejected or overprotected by strangers and relatives. All in all, his social interactions are more complicated because subtle visual cues are missing and facial expressions are lost. As a result, many self help skills that are normally learned by watching are delayed in blind children. Chewing, scooping, self feeding skills may be delayed 2 years or more. Brushing teeth is difficult to accomplish since the child may reject the texture and has no opportunity to observe others performing grooming skills. Fear of unknown and inability to locate the bathroom may contribute to delayed toilet training. One of the most common misconceptions about blind children is that they are equally or more adept in language skills than their normally sighted peers. In reality, severe and early impairments are likely to affect the language development. The differences in part are due to limited access to the environment and to the differences in verbal feedback from people around them. They lack visual references and have reduced integration of information from their parents. More studies have found that the language of visually impaired children is more self oriented and that the word meanings are more limited than for normally sighted children. Vision enables us to perceive objects in their totality and in context. Severely visually impaired children have to rely on sequential observation. They can see or touch only part of an object and from this limited information build up an image of components. Awareness of relationship between objects occurs later and initially connections between sounds and objects are not often made. Based on the different conceptualization of the environment, visually impaired children may follow alternative paths of language development. The use and nature of language differs in nonverbal patterns of communication, loudness, posture, smiling, and other facial expressions, and they rely on standard expressions. Auditory memory skills may play a different role in language development, which may lead to a skewed perception of the ability to use language in comparison to sighted children. Verbal reasoning skills appear to lag behind auditory memory skills that can cause problems when having to change topics quickly or when incorporating broader meanings of a word, particularly in social situations. Syntax and grammar seem to develop in a similar manner to sighted children, but the blind child and sighted listener may have difficulty understanding each other's reference. Birmingham in 1972 reported a higher incidence of echolalia or meaningless repetition of words is noted among visually impaired children. Although visually impaired children may be more aware of the presence of auditory clues in conversations, this does not necessarily mean that they have correctly identified the implied meaning. For visually impaired children, the process of adapting to society will differ from that of normally sighted children. Many social clues take the form of body language and therefore require vision in order to be understood. Congenitally blind children are not aware of the reactions from others to their own body language unless they are specifically taught. Low vision children who have behavioral adaptation to make their sight more functional may communicate to body language that implies feelings that they are actually experiencing. Visually impaired children often face problems in social integration, although they may have a great desire to belong to a group, they may have fears about how to go about it. This shift from family norms to peer group norms can be very difficult, and the pressure to be normal can further inhibit this integration. The visually impaired infant may jabber and imitate sooner than a sighted child, but may show delay when combining words to make his wants known. The blind child primarily uses language to satisfy his immediate needs or to describe current activities. He initiates a few questions and his use of adjectives is sparse or limited. The blind child may take in the sounds which make up the language but may not grasp the meaning intended by the speaker. His sensory experiences are not readily coded into language. He may store phrases and sentences in his memory and repeat them out of context. As stated earlier, the blind child often has a language that is echolalic and meaningless. The early language of the blind child does not seem to mirror his developing knowledge of the world, but rather his knowledge of the language of others. The visually impaired children show approximately the same distribution of scores on intellectual tests as sighted individuals when tests like auditory vocal or motor channels of communication are used. They have relatively normal educational achievement. They tend to achieve more poorly in subjects such as mathematics because of more abstract concepts and also not adapting appropriate method of teaching this subject. The impact of visual impairment in cognitive development is manifested in the construct of world. The visually impaired child has limited ability to coordinate and organize elements into higher levels of abstraction and to verify the information. Therefore, he constructs a reality that is different from the sighted child. The process of establishing concept defining attributes and relationship is more problematic for the blind child and less accessible to guidance. The blind child is continuously involved in problem solving, but this process, which is essential to future development, is more difficult and less rewarding for him. A stable visual field is the basis of object permanence and the other conceptual tasks. Object permanence cannot be obtained by a blind child until he has the ability to reach for objects based on sound clue alone. It is acquired nearly a year later than in sighted children. Since the results of the actions cannot be seen, the blind child may not be motivated to action. He may not understand his ability to cause things to happen or to retain pleasurable stimuli. In addition, these children have difficulty in understanding object permanence. Understanding how to align blocks or orient his hands on a page in order to duplicate a pattern will be difficult if he has not observed objects in various orientations to know that an object is same regardless of its position in space. They have limited opportunities to explore objects that are similar or different. Concepts of same and different can evolve only if children identify the distinguishing variable on which to focus. A blind child has little difficulty generalizing across size, but numerous experiences with a variety of similar objects were required to expedite generalization and association skills. A blind child exhibits delays in conservation of substance, weight, volume, length, and liquids. They show less effective use of gestures and bodily action. Example, hand and head movement. They may use less lip movement in the articulation of sounds. Visually impaired individuals are all very different. The degree of impairment, personality, intelligence, background, and the presence of other disabilities all have varying effects. For instance, cognitive ability will affect the ability to conceptualize the environment in the absence or reduction of visual information. Temperament and personal characteristics may facilitate or interfere with adaptive tasks. As a visually impaired child grows older, although acuity may remain constant, visual function seems to improve as they gradually learn how to use the residual vision more. Visual impairment refers to all degrees of reduction in vision. Blindness is defined as having no more vision than light perception in both eyes. Vision loss can impact all areas of development. Visual impairment affects three important areas. It affects the type of experience the child has. Visual impairment affects the ability for travel within the environment. It imposes limitations in their involvement in the communities. Social development is affected as children are not able to pick up on non-verbal clues. They lack vitality and physical stamina. They have poor posture. One of the most common misconceptions about the blind children is that they are equally or more adept in language skills than their normally sighted peers. In reality, severe and early impairments are likely to affect the language development of visually impaired children. The visually impaired children show approximately the same distribution of scores on intellectual tests as sighted individuals when tests such as auditory vocal or motor channels of communications are used. They have relatively normal educational achievement. Visually impaired individuals are all very different. The degree of impairment, personality, intelligence, background, and the presence of other disabilities all have varying effects. Thank you.